She told the whole family I abandoned her child. 2 years later, she's the one showing up at my door whispering, "I can't do this anymore." She thinks I'm here to save her again. But she doesn't know I've already saved myself. She never saw it coming. I remember the first time I held her. 3 pounds, 4 ounces of fragile existence, wrapped in a hospital blanket too big for her tiny body. My niece, my sister's daughter, with translucent skin and eyes that hadn't yet learned to focus. I pressed my finger into her palm and felt her instinctively grip it, this reflex of trust that made my throat tighten. "She likes you," my sister had whispered from her hospital bed, her voice raspy from exhaustion. I didn't know then that this moment would become a memory I'd return to over and over, searching for the exact second when responsibility transferred from her hands to mine. There was no ceremonial passing of duty, no contract sign. Just a gradual, insidious shift, like water seeping through concrete, finding every crack and weakness until the foundation begins to crumble. My sister was 20 when she had her daughter. I was 16, still navigating high school dramas and college applications. Our parents, ever present but worn down by decades of my sister's chaos, had greeted their granddaughter with a mixture of joy and resignation. They knew, as perhaps I should have, what was coming. 3 years passed this way, my sister alternating between fierce maternal devotion and prolonged absences, my parents stepping in when needed, and me watching from what I believed was a safe distance. Until February, when my sister's voice broke over the phone as she admitted she couldn't make rent again. That she needed help getting to her jobs across town. That she needed someone to watch her daughter. "Just until I get back on my feet," she'd promised. I was 19, between jobs, with time on my hands, and the naive confidence of someone who believes love is enough to fix another person's broken parts. So I said yes. I said yes without understanding that some vessels can't be filled, no matter how much you pour into them. The routine established itself quickly. I'd drive my sister to her first job in the morning, take my niece back to my apartment, then pick my sister up, drop her at her second job, and bring my niece home again. In the evenings, I'd repeat the journey in reverse. 4 hours of driving each day, my gas tank and savings account draining in tandem. My niece, this small, solemn child with her mother's eyes and a vocabulary too limited for her age, would sit quietly in her car seat, watching the world through the window. She rarely asked questions. She never complained. Even at 3, she had learned that her needs were an inconvenience. At first, I didn't notice the weight settling onto my shoulders. I was helping family. This was temporary, necessary, good. I told myself this as I watched my niece eat the meals I prepared with a kind of desperate hunger. As I bathed her and discovered bruises I couldn't remember seeing form. As I read her the same 3 books each night, because they were all she had. In those early weeks, I believed I was witnessing temporary hardship. I didn't understand I was watching neglect take root. By April, the cracks in our arrangement were impossible to ignore. I had found a job. Something with potential. Something that required my presence and energy. My siblings had been helping when they could, but they had their own lives, their own responsibilities. None of us had signed up to be parents. My sister's apartment had been lost weeks before, the eviction notice coming as a surprise only to her. She'd moved into our parents' house with a suitcase of clothes and boxes of possessions she never unpacked. Her daughter's things fit into a single plastic bin. The first time I found my niece alone in her car seat, positioned in front of a television playing cartoons, she was too young to understand. My sister was passed out in her bedroom. The air smelled of alcohol and something else. A sweeter, herbal scent I recognized from college parties. My niece's diaper was soaked through, her legs and the car seat damp. When I picked her up, she didn't cry or reach for me. She remained limp, passive, as though being moved by adult hands was so common an occurrence that it warranted no reaction. "What are you doing here?" my sister had demanded when I woke her, anger flashing across her face before recognition set in. "Oh, it's you!" "She's been sitting in her own waste for hours," I said, my voice shaking with an emotion I couldn't yet name. "She needs to be changed and fed." My sister had rubbed her face, squinting at the daylight coming through her blinds. I was going to do it. I just needed a nap. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. So I nodded and helped her up, handed her a clean diaper, and watched as she performed the mechanical motions of caring for her child. But something had shifted inside me, a seed of doubt that would grow into a forest of concern. Well, that evening, when I drove her to her second job, I tried to talk to her. About her drinking. About leaving my niece alone. About the fact that a 3-year-old needed more than a screen and a car seat for company. You don't understand what it's like, she'd snapped, her eyes fixed on the passing buildings. You get to hand her back at the end of the day. Non-normal. Deus and what? I don't. She's all mine. All the time. The way she said it, not with love or pride but with resentment, made my stomach clench. But I swallowed my response because we were at her workplace, and she was already late, and arguing would only make things worse for my niece, who was sleeping in the back seat, thumb firmly in her mouth. As the weeks progressed, I began to notice my niece's clothes hanging looser on her frame. Her pediatrician had expressed concern about weight loss during her 3-year checkup. She needs protein, he'd said, looking over his glasses at my sister. Vegetables, not just carbohydrates. I'd started bringing meals when I picked them up, simple things like chicken, rice, steamed broccoli. Foods a child could eat that would give her the nutrition she needed. Half the time, I'd find these containers untouched in their refrigerator days later, while new McDonald's bags overflowed from the trash. The first time I refused to drive my sister to work, I felt physical pain in my chest. I'd lost 2 tires in a month to poorly maintained roads and highway debris. My savings had dwindled to almost nothing. I was exhausted, running on fumes, trying to balance my new job with the hours spent as an unpaid chauffeur and childcare provider. I can't do this anymore, I'd said, my voice barely above a whisper. I need to focus on my job. I can't keep paying for gas and repairs. Her face had hardened, her eyes narrowing to slits. So you're abandoning us? After everything I've done for you? I couldn't think of a single thing she'd done for me in years. Not one act of kindness or support. But I didn't say this. Instead, I promised to ask our other siblings to help, to find a solution, to not leave her stranded. But my siblings were reaching their limits too. My brother had missed work to drive her. My other sister had canceled plans. We were all being pulled into an orbit of chaos that had been my sister's constant companion since adolescence. When our parents finally spoke up, it wasn't with anger, but with a weary resignation that broke my heart. We can't do everything for you, our mother had said. You need to step up for your daughter. Find work closer to home. Save money for a car. My sister looked at her with such hatred that I'd physically recoiled. You've never supported me, she'd hiss, not once in my entire life. The revisionist history was staggering. Our parents had bailed her out of trouble since she was 13, paid fines, hired lawyers, funded rehab stays, covered rent when she spent her money elsewhere. They'd never given up on her, even when everyone else had urged them to practice tough love. But in her narrative, she was the victim. Always misunderstood, always unsupported. And now increasingly, we were the villains of her story, the family who wouldn't drop everything to rescue her from the consequences of her own decisions. May 10th remains carved into my memory like an epitaph. I was at work, focusing on a project that required my full attention, when my phone began to vibrate incessantly against my desk. One text, one, then another, then 20 more, in rapid succession. My sister was having a meltdown in our family group chat. Paragraph after paragraph of accusations and vitriol. We were a horrible support system. We had abandoned her when she needed us most. We knew she had to be at work. We didn't. With each message, her language grew more erratic, her threats more concerning. I'm going to pawn all her toys, she wrote about my niece. She doesn't need them anyway. I don't want any of you near her ever again. You're dead to me. All of you. My hands trembled as I read the barrage. My supervisor noticed my distress and told me to take a break, to handle whatever family emergency had arisen. But there was no handling this. My sister was in a spiral I'd seen before, one that usually ended with scorched earth and months of silence before she inevitably needed something again. I stepped outside into the May sunshine, sat on a bench, and called my brother. He answered on the first ring. Are you seeing this? He asked, his voice tight. Yes. I don't understand what happened. Did someone say something to set her off? Not that I know of. Mom asked if she needed a ride to work since her rideshare didn't show up. That's all. We stayed on the phone, watching the messages continue to flood in. Our other sister had already removed herself from the group chat, sending me a private text that simply read, I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. I understood. I felt the same bone-deep exhaustion, the same helpless rage. But there was my niece to consider. This small person who had done nothing to deserve the chaos swirling around her. What about your daughter? I finally texted my sister. What does she eat if you pawn her toys for food money? The response was immediate. Don't you dare question how I feed my child. But I had seen what she fed her child. Stale chips. Day-old bagels. Fast food when she remembered. Nothing at all when she didn't. The next day I went to the store and filled a cart with things my niece needed. Wipes, pull-ups, fruits, vegetables, yogurt, cheese, chicken nuggets, books, a new set of clothes. I drove to my parents' house where my sister and niece were still staying and carried the bags to the door. My sister opened it before I could knock, her body blocking the entrance, her eyes bloodshot and unfocused. What do you want? She demanded. I brought some things for your daughter, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Food, clothes, some books. She looked at the bags, then back at me. We don't need your charity. It's not charity. It's help for your daughter. Take it and get out, she said, her voice flat. We don't want anything from you. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of my niece sitting on the floor of the living room, watching us with wide, solemn eyes. She didn't call out to me, when you're busy, by one day, why? She didn't smile or wave. She just watched, as though observing a scene from a movie that had nothing to do with her. Can I at least say hello to her? I asked. No, Danje. You lost that privilege when you abandoned us. The door closed in my face, leaving me standing on the porch with bags of groceries and a hollowness in my chest that felt like grief. I left the bags there, knowing they would likely remain untouched, knowing my sister's pride was more powerful than her daughter's hunger. That night, I cried until my throat was raw. I cried for my niece, trapped in a life with a mother who saw her as an extension of herself, rather than as a person with needs and rights of her own. I cried for my sister, lost in a maze of addiction and mental illness that she refused to acknowledge. I cried for my family, fractured by years of walking on eggshells around someone who wielded her pain like a weapon. But mostly, I cried for myself, for the guilt that consumed me, even though logically I knew I had done all I could, for the anger that simmered beneath my skin, threatening to boil over, for the helplessness that had become my constant companion. I wanted to save my niece. I wanted to rescue her from a situation that was slowly destroying her spirit. But I couldn't. Not without legal intervention, not without proof of neglect that rose to the level required by overworked social services departments. Not without tearing my family apart even more than it already was. So I sat in my car outside my parents' house the next day, watching the windows for movement, hoping for a glimpse of my niece, wondering if this was what giving up felt like, this mixture of resignation and despair, this knowledge that sometimes love isn't enough to change another person's destructive path. Chapter 4. The long silence days stretched into weeks. My sister maintained her silence, occasionally breaking it to send a particularly vicious text to one of us when she needed to vent her rage. My parents, caught in the impossible position of wanting to protect their granddaughter while not alienating their daughter, walked a tightrope of careful interactions. I threw myself into work, into exercise, into anything that would distract me from the constant worry about my niece. I checked social media obsessively for updates from my sister, searching for evidence that my niece was okay, that she was being fed and clothed and loved. There was nothing. The guilt was a physical presence, a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe sometimes. Logic told me that I'd done what I could, given time, money, emotional support, practical help. But my heart told me I'd failed the person who needed me most. One evening, about a month after that day on the porch, my phone rang with my mother's number. Your sister lost both jobs, she said without preamble. She's not looking for new ones. She sleeps all day and stays up all night. Your niece is eating nothing but bagels and whatever snack she can find for herself. My grip tightened on the phone. Has anyone called CPS? A long pause. You know how that would end? She'd never forgive us. We'd never see your niece again. She might be better off in foster care, I said, the words burning my throat as they emerged. Another pause, longer this time. Would she though? You know the statistics as well as I do. She was right. The foster care system was overwhelmed, underfunded, imperfect. Children fell through the cracks. They were moved from home to home. They suffered abuses that sometimes rivaled or exceeded what they experienced in their biological families. What can we do then? I asked, my voice breaking. "I don't know," my mother admitted. "I really don't know anymore." After we hung up, I sat on my couch, staring at the wall. The helplessness was suffocating. I had spent months trying to save my sister and niece, and all I had to show for it was a fractured family, an empty bank account, and a niece who was no better off than before. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. I couldn't force my sister to be the mother her daughter deserved. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own mental and financial health on the altar of a relationship that had become toxic and one-sided. So I let go. Not of my love for my niece, that would remain constant, a pilot light in the darkness. But of the responsibility I'd taken on that was never mine to carry. Of the guilt that wasn't mine to bear. Of the desperate need to fix a situation that perhaps couldn't be fixed. I blocked my sister's number. I deleted social media apps from my phone. I wrote a letter to my niece that she might never read, telling her how much I loved her, how none of this was her fault, how I would always be there when she was ready to find me. And then I focused on rebuilding my life, on establishing boundaries that should have been in place years before, on healing the parts of me that had been damaged by the cyclone of my sister's chaos. It felt like betrayal. It felt like relief. It felt like grief and liberation tangled together in a knot I couldn't unravel. 6 months passed in relative silence. I heard updates about my sister and niece through my parents, who maintained cautious contact. My sister had found a new job, closer to home. She was drinking less, they thought. My niece had gained some weight, was speaking more, seemed happier. I wanted to believe these reports. I needed to believe them. But I had seen too many cycles of improvement and deterioration to trust that this one would last. On my niece's 4th birthday, I sent a gift through my parents, a set of books, clothes in her size, a stuffed animal that reminded me of one she'd loved when I used to watch her. I didn't expect acknowledgement. I didn't get any. The holidays approached, and with them, the inevitable family gatherings that would force us into the same space. I considered making excuses, avoiding the potential confrontation. But that felt like another form of running away, and I was tired of running. So I went to my parents' house for Thanksgiving, prepared for either frost or a fire from my sister. What I wasn't prepared for was her absence. She'd called that morning to say they weren't coming. No explanation. No rescheduling. Just another silent door closing. Christmas brought the same pattern. Promises to appear, last-minute cancellations. My niece's presents remained wrapped under my parents' tree until they finally mailed them to my sister's new apartment in January. The pattern continued through the spring, brief periods of communication, followed by longer periods of silence. Updates that grew increasingly vague as my parents tried to protect both their daughters from the truth of the situation. And then, on a rainy Tuesday in April, almost a year after I'd made the decision to step back, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I considered not answering. But something, intuition, perhaps, pulled me to the door. My sister stood on my porch, soaking wet, no umbrella, no coat. Alone. "Where's your daughter?" I asked immediately, fear spiking through me. "With Mom and Dad," she said, her voice hoarse. "Can I come in?" I hesitated only a moment before stepping back to let her pass. She entered my apartment like a ghost, pale, insubstantial, haunting the edges of my life. She didn't sit, though I gestured toward the couch. Instead, she paced, her wet shoes leaving marks on my floor that I couldn't bring myself to care about. "I need help," she finally said, the words seeming to catch in her throat. Those 3 words, "I need help," that I'd been waiting to hear for years. Not "I need money" or "I need a ride" or "I need childcare," but the simple, stark admission that she couldn't continue on her current path. "What kind of help?" I asked carefully. "I don't know how to be a mother," she whispered, and then she was crying. Deep, racking sobs that bent her double, that forced her finally onto my couch, where she curled into herself like a wounded animal. I didn't touch her. I didn't offer platitudes or easy forgiveness. I sat in the chair across from her and waited for the storm to pass. When she could speak again, she told me about her struggle with depression, with alcohol, with the marijuana that had become her way of numbing the panic that set in whenever she looked at her daughter and realized the enormity of her responsibility. She told me about the night she'd almost hurt her child, had raised her hand in anger, and then been so horrified by her own impulse that she'd locked herself in the bathroom for hours, leaving my niece alone and afraid. "I'm not fit to be her mother," she said finally. "I never was." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with truth, and consequence. I wanted to disagree, to offer comfort or reassurance. But I couldn't lie to her, not now when she was finally facing the reality I'd seen for months. "What are you going to do?" I asked instead. "I don't know. Mom and Dad say they'll help more. But they're getting older. They can't raise another child." The unspoken question hovered between us. Would I take her daughter? Would I step into the role I'd already partially assumed? "I need time to think," I said, finally. "This isn't a decision to make lightly." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I understand." But did she? Did she understand what she was asking of me? To become a parent overnight? To rearrange my life around a child who had already experienced more trauma than most adults? Did I understand what I would be agreeing to if I said yes? We sat in silence for a long time, the rain tapping against my windows, the clock on my wall, marking minutes that felt like hours. Finally, my sister stood. "I should go," she said. "Thank you for listening." I walked her to the door, watching as she stepped back into the rain, without an umbrella, without a plan, without anything but the vague hope that someone would solve the problem she'd created. As I closed the door behind her, I realized something crucial. This wasn't a moment of transformation for her. It wasn't rock bottom or a turning point. It was simply another chapter in a story that had been repeating itself since she was a teenager. Crisis, appeal for help, temporary improvement, inevitable backslide. And maybe that was the truth I'd been avoiding all along. That some cycles aren't meant to be broken from the outside. That some people can't be saved, no matter how much you love them, or how hard you try. The decision didn't come to me in a lightning flash of clarity. It formed slowly, taking shape over days of reflection, of conversations with my parents and siblings, of late nights spent staring at my ceiling, weighing options and outcomes. In the end, it wasn't just about what I could offer my niece. It was about what I could reasonably sustain, about the life I wanted for myself, about the boundaries I needed to maintain for my own well-being. I called my sister a week after her visit. "I can't take your daughter," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I want to be part of her life. I want to be her aunt, to see her regularly, to support her, to love her. But I can't be her primary caregiver." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke. "I understand." Two words that contained multitudes: disappointment, resignation, perhaps even relief. I couldn't tell which emotion predominated, and maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had spoken my truth, had drawn a boundary that felt right. "What will you do?" I asked. "Mom and Dad have offered to let us stay with them for a while. They'll help with childcare while I go to therapy and look for a job closer to home." It wasn't a perfect solution. My parents were in their 60s, with health issues of their own. My sister's history suggested this arrangement would become permanent rather than temporary. But it was something, a stopgap that would keep my niece fed and sheltered and loved, while my sister attempted again to get her life together. "I think that's a good idea," I said. "And I'd like to help when I can. Weekend visits, maybe. I could take her to the park or to the library." "She'd like that," my sister said, and for the first time in our conversation, her voice softened. "She asks about you, sometimes." The knowledge that my niece remembered me, thought of me, asked for me. It broke something open inside my chest, a tender spot I'd been protecting for months. "I'd like that too," I said quietly. We ended the call with tentative plans for me to visit that weekend. As I put down my phone, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because the situation was resolved, it wasn't, and might never be, but because I had found a way to stay connected to my niece without sacrificing my own well-being on the altar of my sister's chaos. The weekend visit was awkward at first. My niece was shy, hiding behind my mother's legs when I arrived. But gradually, as we played with blocks on the living room floor, as I read her favorite book, she still had it, the one about the rabbit family, she warmed to me again. By the time I left, she had given me a fierce hug and extracted a promise that I would return the following weekend. And I did. Each Saturday, I showed up at my parents' house with a small gift: a book, a coloring page, a hair clip. I took my niece to the park, to the children's museum, sometimes just for a walk around the neighborhood. I watched her personality re-emerge from behind the shell of wariness she'd developed. Her curiosity, her humor, her joy. My sister's progress was slower, more halting. There were good weeks when she attended therapy, looked for jobs, engaged with her daughter. There were bad weeks when she disappeared into her room, when the sweet smell of marijuana seeped under her door, when her eyes were glazed and unfocused at dinner. But there was movement, however slight. And in that movement I found hope. Not the naive hope of complete transformation, but the realistic hope of incremental improvement. As for me, I was learning to navigate this new reality. To be present without being responsible. To offer support without enabling. To love without losing myself in the process. It wasn't easy. There were days when I wanted to scoop up my niece and take her away from a situation that still felt precarious. There were days when my sister's behavior made me so angry, I had to leave the house to avoid saying things I couldn't take back. There were days when the weight of uncertainty about my niece's future pressed so heavily on my chest that I could barely breathe. But there were also days of unexpected joy. Of my niece's laughter as we chased bubbles in the backyard. Of my sister, clear-eyed and present, joining us for a game of Go Fish. Of my parents, watching their granddaughter bloom, some of the worry lines easing from their faces. 6 months into this new arrangement, my sister found a job at a daycare center near our parents' house, a position that came with a discount for my niece to attend. It wasn't glamorous work, and the pay was modest, but it was stable, close to home, and gave her a purpose beyond herself. "I like it," she told me one evening as we sat on our parents' porch, watching my niece draw with sidewalk chalk. "The kids, they don't care about my past. They just want me to play with them, to listen to them. I can do that." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It was the first time in years I'd heard her talk about work with anything approaching enthusiasm. "I know I've been a terrible sister," she continued, her eyes fixed on her daughter. "A terrible mother. I don't expect you to forgive me for everything." "I'm not sure if forgiveness is the point," I said carefully. I think understanding might be more important. And boundaries." She nodded slowly. "I'm trying to learn about those. In therapy." We sat in silence for a while longer, watching my niece create elaborate chalk pictures on the driveway. There was so much more to say, so many years of hurt and resentment and fear to work through. But for now, this moment of quiet acknowledgement felt like enough. 2 years have passed since that rainy day when my sister appeared on my doorstep. 2 years of small steps forward and occasional steps back. 2 years of rebuilding trust, of establishing new patterns, of learning to relate to each other as adults rather than as extensions of our childhood selves. My niece is 6 now, a first grader with a passion for dinosaurs and a stubborn streak she comes by honestly. She splits her time between my parents' house, where my sister still lives, and my apartment, where she has her own bedroom now. She's no longer the solemn passive child I once watched from a distance, she argues. She laughs, she expresses her opinions with the confidence of someone who knows she is loved. My sister has been sober for 18 months. She still struggles with depression, still attends therapy twice a week, still has days when getting out of bed seems impossible. But she hasn't disappeared on her daughter in over a year. She calls when she needs help, rather than letting the situation deteriorate to crisis level. She's learning, slowly, to be the parent her daughter needs. As for me, I've made peace with the role I play in their lives. Not a savior or a martyr, but a sister, an aunt, a support person who maintains healthy boundaries. I no longer feel the crushing weight of responsibility for their well-being. I no longer wake in the night, consumed by worry about my niece's safety. Do I still worry? Of course. There are no guarantees in this fragile arrangement we've created. My sister could relapse. My parents' health could deteriorate. My niece could face challenges beyond what we can currently imagine. But I've learned to live with uncertainty. To accept that I cannot control the future, only how I respond to it. To trust that whatever comes, we will face it together, not as a dysfunctional system of enablers and addicts, but as a family that has learned, through pain and perseverance, how to love each other better. Last month, my sister apologized to me. Not in grand dramatic fashion, but quietly, as we washed dishes after a family dinner. "I know sorry doesn't cover it," she said, her hands submerged in soapy water, "but I am. For everything." I passed her a plate to rinse, I know. "I never understood why you kept trying," she continued. "After all of the things I said to you. All the ways I pushed you away." I thought about it for a moment, searching for the honest answer rather than the easy one. "I kept trying because I love you," I said finally, "and because I love your daughter. But I had to learn that loving you didn't mean sacrificing myself." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the dish in her hands. "I'm glad you didn't give up on us entirely." "Me too," I said, and I meant it. We finished the dishes in companionable silence, the sounds of my parents playing with my niece drifting in from the living room. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Those exist only in fairy tales. It was messy and incomplete, and fraught with the knowledge that our history would always be part of our present. But there was peace in the acknowledgement of our shared journey, in the recognition that we had both done the best we could with the tools we had at the time, in the hope that, with better tools and deeper understanding, we could build something stronger together. I don't know what the future holds for my sister, for my niece, for our family. I don't know if the progress we've made will last, or if we'll face new challenges that test the boundaries and trust we've established. What I do know is that I no longer carry the crushing weight of guilt that once defined my relationship with them. I've learned that sometimes letting go is not an act of abandonment, but an act of love, for others and for yourself. That healthy distance can foster healing in ways that suffocating closeness cannot. Most importantly, I've learned that forgiveness is not a single act, but a daily choice. A choice to see the humanity in someone who has hurt you. A choice to believe in the possibility of change, however incremental. A choice to acknowledge the past without letting it dictate the future. My sister and I will never have the easy, uncomplicated relationship I once longed for. There is too much history, too much pain, too many scars that have formed over wounds that will never fully heal. But we have something else now, something hard-won and precious. A relationship based on truth rather than illusion, on mutual respect rather than codependence, on the understanding that love, real love, requires both compassion and boundaries. And that, I've come to believe, is enough.